For 54 years, nothing on Earth was supposed to be able to touch it. A bronze giant stood over the harbor of Rhodes, taller than any statue the ancient world had ever built. A god cast in metal, forged from the weapons of an enemy army that had failed to take the city. It was a message aimed at every rival power in the Mediterranean. You cannot break us. Then, in a matter of seconds, the ground did what an entire invading army couldn't. The Colossus snapped at the knees and crashed to the earth, and it stayed there, broken, for the next 800 years. Longer than it had ever stood upright, longer than most empires last. So how does a monument built to prove a city was unbreakable end up as history's most famous ruin? The answer isn't really the earthquake. That was just the trigger. The real answer is buried in the decisions Rhodes made 12 years earlier, when it chose exactly how to build a giant. Decisions that solved one problem and quietly guaranteed another. To understand that, we have to go back to a war Rhodes never wanted, against an enemy whose name literally meant the besieger of cities. By the early 3rd century BCE, Alexander the Great had been dead for a generation, and his empire had fractured into competing kingdoms run by his former generals, men historians call the Diadochi, the successors. Rhodes, a small island city-state in the eastern Aegean, had built its entire identity around staying out of that fight. It wasn't a military superpower, it was a trading power, and its system reflected that. Rhodes governed itself as a moderate democracy, and its ships carried grain, timber, and goods across the eastern Mediterranean under maritime laws so respected that later Roman and even Byzantine legal codes borrowed from them. Its wealth came from controlling shipping lanes between Greece, Asia Minor, and Egypt, and its survival strategy was neutrality, official friendliness to everyone, deep loyalty to no one. That strategy worked, right up until it didn't. Rhodes had grown close to Ptolemy I, the general who had taken control of Egypt, because Egyptian grain and trade were central to Rhodian prosperity. But that friendship put Rhodes on the wrong side of Antigonus I, one of the most powerful of Alexander's former commanders, who controlled large parts of Greece and Asia Minor. In 305 BCE, Antigonus sent his son to force Rhodes into line. That son's name was Demetrius. History remembers him by his nickname, Poliorcetes, the besieger of cities, and he earned it here. Demetrius arrived with a large army and a fleet built specifically to break fortified island cities. His engineers constructed massive floating siege towers, and when those failed in a storm, he built something even larger, a land-based tower called the Helios, reportedly several stories tall, armored, and packed with catapults on multiple levels. This wasn't just brute force, it was applied military engineering designed to make Rhodes' walls irrelevant. Rhodes couldn't outbuild that, so it outthought it. When the Helios approached, Rhodian defenders flooded the ground in front of their walls, turning solid earth into mud the tower couldn't roll across. Rhodian ships slipped out and sank sections of Demetrius's naval siege equipment before it could be deployed. For a full year, the city held. Here's what mattered most, though, and it's easy to miss if you only focus on the walls. Rhodes survived because it had built something more valuable than fortifications, a system of alliances. Ptolemy kept supply lines open, and historians note that Demetrius's attention was never fully on Rhodes alone. The wider war among Alexander's successors was pulling at him from the mainland the entire time, making an endless siege increasingly costly for gains that were shrinking by the month. When a relief fleet from Egypt finally arrived in 304 BCE, Demetrius made the calculation every siege commander eventually has to make, that the cost of continuing had outgrown the value of winning, and he withdrew, abandoning most of his siege equipment on the beach as he left. That equipment is where this story turns from a military account into an engineering one. The Rhodians sold the abandoned siege machinery, reportedly for 300 talents, a substantial sum, and decided to spend it on something symbolic rather than practical. Instead of new walls or ships, they commissioned a colossal bronze statue of Helios, the sun god, whom they credited with their survival and who was already central to Rhodian identity. Helios wasn't a random choice of patron. Rhodian myth held that the island itself had risen from the sea as a gift to the sun god, and the city had celebrated him for generations with athletic and chariot festivals. Turning the tools of a failed conquest into an offering to that same god wasn't just proud. It was, in the Rhodians' own religious logic, a way of closing the loop on the story. The project went to a local sculptor named Chares of Lindos, who had trained under Lysippos, one of the most respected sculptors of the age, known for his own large-scale bronze work. This is where the story stops being about war and starts being about systems, because building something this large, in this era, with this technology, was its own kind of siege, just against physics. Construction began around 292 BCE and took 12 years. According to the ancient writer Philo of Byzantium, Chares built the statue in horizontal sections, casting one level of bronze at a time, then burying the completed portion under an enormous earthen mound before starting the next level above it. Picture it not as a statue rising into the sky, but as a hill of packed dirt that grew taller year after year, hiding a bronze god inside it, section by section. Only at the very end was all that earth removed, revealing the finished figure all at once. Structurally, the Colossus stood on a stone and marble base near the harbor entrance, its feet carved in stone and sheathed in bronze plate, its legs and body built around an iron skeletal frame. Iron bars radiated outward from the ankles, curving upward to follow the shape of the legs and torso. Bronze plates, some over a meter square, were riveted onto that frame to form the visible skin. Ancient accounts suggest more than 10 tons of bronze went into the statue, along with a significant weight of iron for the internal frame. Inside, the hollow structure was partially filled and weighted with stone, which Pliny, the elder, later observed firsthand. Workers had used the rubble to stabilize the statue as it rose, exactly how Helios was posed, arms at his sides, one hand raised to shield his eyes, isn't something ancient sources agree on, and modern historians treat any specific reconstruction of the pose as an educated guess rather than a certainty. Standing roughly 70 cubits, about 33 meters, close to 108 feet, the Colossus was the tallest statue in the ancient world when it was finished around 280 BCE, and contrary to the image most people carry in their heads, it did not straddle the harbor with ships sailing between its legs. That version, the Colossus as a bronze arch over the water, comes from Renaissance artists centuries later. No ancient source describes it that way, and the engineering of the time couldn't have supported it. The real Colossus stood upright on solid ground, both feet planted near the harbor rather than over it. For a moment, this looked like an unqualified success. Ancient writers, cataloging the great monuments of the known world, ranked the Colossus among the finest achievements humanity had produced, and it endures today as one of the 7 wonders. It became a symbol not just of religious devotion, but of Rhodian identity. A small trading city that had outthought and outlasted an empire, and had the bronze giant to prove it. That reputation wasn't only cultural. Rhodes's navy spent the following decades patrolling the eastern Mediterranean against piracy, protecting the same trade routes that had made the city wealthy in the first place, which meant that by the time the Colossus was finished, Rhodes wasn't just admired, it was useful to nearly every trading power in the region. That distinction is about to matter enormously. But here's the problem. The very design decisions that made the Colossus possible to build were the same decisions that made it structurally fragile. This is worth sitting with, because it's the core of the whole story. Chares and his workshop were solving an engineering puzzle no one had solved before at this scale. How do you get a hollow bronze figure, standing on relatively narrow ankles, to hold its own weight against gravity for years, decades, generations? Their answer, an iron skeleton, riveted bronze plating, and interior stone ballast, was clever. It worked for holding the statue up under its own static weight, what it was never designed for, because no one at the time had a framework to design for it, was a lateral shock. A sideways, sudden, violent force. And Rhodes sits on one of the most seismically active stretches of the eastern Mediterranean, along what's now called the Hellenic Arc. Earthquakes there weren't rare freak events. They were, and still are, a recurring feature of the region. A rigid bronze figure, standing on comparatively narrow ankle joints, filled with heavy stone ballast that added mass without adding flexibility, was in some ways a monument built to solve a problem that had nothing to do with the actual risk it faced. The weakness wasn't a mistake in craftsmanship. It was baked into the entire concept of building something this size, this rigid, in this location, with the tools available at the time. That weakness went untested for over 5 decades. Then, in 226 BCE, the ground beneath Rhodes ruptured in what modern seismologists estimate was a major earthquake, likely in the range of magnitude 7, strong enough to be remembered as one of the most destructive natural disasters of the ancient Mediterranean world. This wasn't a disaster that singled out one statue. According to the historian Polybius, writing within living memory of the event, the earthquake tore down stretches of the city's fortification walls, wrecked its dockyards, and destroyed ships in the harbor alongside ordinary homes. The Colossus was simply the largest, most rigid structure in a city that had just been shaken to its foundations, and ancient accounts describe it snapping at the knees, the exact point where the narrow ankle and leg structure met the immense weight of the torso above it. The same joint that had made construction possible became the point of total failure. It didn't lean. It didn't crack slowly. It broke and came down. This is the part where you'd expect the story to end. It doesn't, because what happened next reveals something important about the system Rhodes had spent decades building. Polybius records that in the aftermath, kingdoms from across the Hellenistic world sent aid to Rhodes, not just one benefactor, but several, including Ptolemy III of Egypt, Antigonos Doson of Macedonia, and Seleucus II of Syria, rival kings who rarely agreed on anything. That's not a coincidence. Rhodes's decades of studied neutrality and its role protecting Mediterranean trade routes meant that keeping the city stable was in almost everyone's interest. The same alliance-based strategy that had saved Rhodes from Demetrius's army a century earlier was now rebuilding its walls and its harbor. The system worked exactly as designed. The Colossus, though, was treated differently. Among the aid offered, ancient accounts specifically credit Ptolemy III with funds earmarked to restore the statue itself. Rhodes, even freshly rebuilt and financially supported, ultimately chose not to use them. Tradition holds that an oracle associated with Delphi warned the Rhodians against rebuilding, suggesting that Helios himself had been offended and that restoration would be an act of impiety rather than devotion. Whether every detail of that account is precise, the underlying decision is well attested. Rhodes rebuilt almost everything the earthquake destroyed, except the one monument that had come to define the city. It's worth pausing on why that decision made sense beyond religious caution. Rebuilding the exact same design would have meant recreating the exact same vulnerability. The system that built the Colossus in the first place, a rigid iron and bronze frame filled with stone, hadn't evolved. Nothing about seismic engineering had changed in 50 years. A second Colossus, built the same way, in the same location, would have been a monument to repeating a known failure. Piety gave Rhodes a culturally acceptable reason to walk away from a structurally unsolved problem, so the broken god stayed exactly where it fell. And this is where the legacy gets genuinely strange. The fallen Colossus didn't disappear or get cleared away. It lay in pieces on the ground for centuries, reportedly more than 800 years, and people kept coming to see it anyway. Pliny the Elder, writing around 77 CE, over 300 years after the collapse, described the ruins in vivid detail. Fingers larger than most complete statues, hollow limbs you could see straight through, cavernous broken joints. Few people, he wrote, could wrap their arms around even the thumb. The wonder had become a different kind of wonder, not a monument to strength, but a monument to scale, visible precisely because it had failed. The eventual fate of those remains is far less certain than the statue's construction or collapse. A much later Byzantine chronicler, writing centuries after the fact, claimed that following the Arab conquest of Rhodes in the 600s and 50s CE, the remaining bronze was sold as scrap metal and hauled away by camel caravan. Modern historians treat this account with real caution. It comes from a source written long after the supposed event, with no earlier corroboration. What seems clear is that at some point, the visible remains that Pliny once described simply stopped being part of the historical record. What survived instead was the idea of the Colossus, bigger, in memory, than it may have even been in life. Centuries later, when the Statue of Liberty was built in New York Harbor, the poem inscribed at its base explicitly invoked the brazen giant of Greek fame, borrowing the Colossus's legend to describe a new kind of monument to strength and welcome. The comparison persists today, even though the two statues never shared a design, a pose, or an engineering method. And the question the Rhodians once faced hasn't fully gone away either. Proposals to construct a modern Colossus near the same harbor have surfaced repeatedly since the 1970s, each one running into the same practical wall that stopped the original from ever being rebuilt. Enormous cost, and no guarantee that ambition alone is enough to make something like this last. That's really the heart of this story. The Colossus wasn't destroyed by bad luck. It was destroyed by the gap between what its builders could imagine and what they could actually engineer against. The strength of the statue, its scale, its ambition, its symbolism, was never separate from its weakness. They were the same decision, viewed from two different moments in time. That tension is really what makes Rhodes' giant worth remembering, more than 2,000 years after it fell. Thanks for watching this deep dive into the Colossus of Rhodes. If you enjoyed this kind of history breakdown, consider liking the video and subscribing for more. And I'd love to know what you think. Was the fall of the Colossus inevitable the moment it was built, or could a different design have let it survive?